In the summer of 1906, a young woman travelled to the Adirondacks with the man she believed would finally make things right. Her name was Grace Brown. She was 20 years old, pregnant, and in love with Chester Gillette. She thought the journey to Big Moose Lake would bring answers about their future. Instead, she was found dead in the water. This is the story of Grace Brown, the murder at Big Moose Lake, and the ghost that many believe never left.
Back Market is the best place to get the tech you need for back to school, for less. Like professionally refurbished smartphones to take those first day pics.
Mom, your finger's blocking the camera.
Or so they can ask you to buy a poster board for the science fair tomorrow. No matter what you need it for, the premium refurbished tech on Back Market is guaranteed by the Back Market Promise. Professionally refurbished with a 1-year warranty and free 30-day returns. Save now at backmarket.com.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
Summer's supposed to be the easy season. So why are so many people quietly Googling a therapist between summer Fridays? Because more daylight doesn't fix the hard stuff. Sometimes it just turns the volume up. Grow does therapy differently. Grow connects you with thousands of high-quality licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. The therapist you want takes your insurance on Grow. Grow accepts over 125 insurance plans. Sessions average $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/ACAST today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/ACAST. growtherapy.com/ACAST. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
Summer's supposed to be the easy season. So why are so many people quietly Googling a therapist between summer Fridays? Because more daylight doesn't fix the hard stuff. Sometimes it just turns the volume up. Grow does therapy differently. Grow connects you with thousands of high-quality licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. The therapist you want takes your insurance on Grow. Grow accepts over 125 insurance plans. Sessions average $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/ACAST today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/ACAST. growtherapy.com/ACAST. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
Hello, I'm Sarah, and welcome to The Whispering Woods After Dark. I have got one long story today. This is an older story, but it's really interesting and really, really sad. Right, I'll get straight into it. Are you ready for the story? Before the murder became a famous American case, before the trial, before the newspaper headlines, and before Grace Brown's private letters were read aloud in court, there was the lake. Big Moose Lake lies in the Adirondacks of upstate New York, surrounded by forest, lodges, cabins, and quiet stretches of water. In summer, it can look peaceful, the kind of place people travel to when they want to get away from the noise of towns and cities. A place for boating, walking, fresh air, and long days beside the water. But for more than a century, Big Moose Lake has also been tied to a ghost story. People say that Grace Brown never fully left it. Her apparition is said to appear near the water, sometimes as a young woman in white, sometimes as a glowing figure moving along the shore, and sometimes as something more like a mist rising from the lake. The stories change slightly depending on who tells them, but the centre of the haunting remains the same: a young woman and a lake. One of the best-known modern accounts comes from Covewood Lodge, a resort on Big Moose Lake. In 1988, several people connected to the lodge reported an encounter that would later be featured by Unsolved Mysteries. According to that account, a woman named Rhonda Bousselot went into the staff lodge and immediately felt that something was wrong. She sensed that she was not alone, even though nobody should have been inside. Outside, at around the same time, 3 other people saw a figure on the balcony. It was described as a young woman in old-fashioned clothing, standing silently and looking out towards the lake. She appeared there for a moment, long enough to be seen, and then vanished. Other stories describe strange lights, a feeling of grief near the lake, and a female figure seen along the shore or over the water. Some witnesses have said the sadness of the place feels almost physical, as though the lake itself is holding on to what happened there. And what happened there was not a vague tragedy or an old rumour with no name attached. It was a real death. On 11th of July, 1906, Grace May Brown went out onto Big Moose Lake in a rented rowboat with Chester Gillette, the man she loved, and the man she believed might finally make things right. Grace was 20 years old. She was unmarried, she was pregnant, and she could not swim. By the next day, her body had been recovered from the lake. Chester was gone. At first, the scene looked like an accident. A boat had overturned. A young woman had drowned. But the details soon began to change the story. Grace had injuries to her head. Chester had not drowned with her. He had left the lake and gone on to another hotel. And when investigators began tracing the days before her death, they uncovered a hidden relationship, a pregnancy, a false name, and a bundle of letters that would turn Grace Brown from a drowned girl in the Adirondacks into one of the most talked about murder victims in America. Those letters would later be read aloud in court. They showed a young woman who was frightened, desperate, and still hoping Chester would do the right thing. She trusted him. She'd followed him to the Adirondacks. She'd gone out into the lake with him, and she never came back. That's where the haunting begins. More than 100 years later, people still visit Big Moose Lake for its beauty. They see the trees, the water, the lodges and the shoreline. But behind the scenery is another version of the lake. The one kept alive by local stories, old newspaper reports, books, films and ghost sightings. In that version, Grace Brown is still there, a white figure near the shore. Grace May Brown was born on 20th of March 1886 in South Otselic, New York. She grew up in Shenango County in a rural farming family, far from the hotels, courtrooms and newspaper attention that would later surround her name. Her childhood was not the kind of life that usually appeared in the papers. It was ordinary, local and tied to family, church, work and the rhythms of the countryside. Grace was one of those young women whose life might have remained almost completely private, if not for what happened to her. She was known to her family as Billy, and that detail appears again and again in accounts of her life, and it gives her story a more personal quality. Grace Brown became the name in the trial reports and the newspaper headlines, but to the people who loved her, she was Billy. In 1904, when she was 18, Grace left home and moved to Cortland, New York. She went to live with her older sister, Ada, and found work at the Gillette skirt factory. For Grace, Cortland offered work, independence, and a life beyond the farm. It was not a huge city, but it was a different world from South Otselic. There were factories, boarding houses, shops, social gatherings, and young people trying to make their own way. The Gillette skirt factory was owned by relatives of Chester Gillette. Grace worked there as a factory girl, and it was there that she met Chester. He was not simply another worker on the same floor. Chester was connected to the family that owned the business. His uncle Noah Gillette was one of the factory owners, and Chester worked there in a position that carried more status than Grace's. He came into her life from a different social level, with more freedom, more money, and more protection around him. At first, though, the relationship appears to have grown privately. Chester and Grace began seeing each other, but not publicly in the open way Grace may have wanted. Their relationship was kept quiet. Chester did not introduce her as a fiancé. He did not tie himself to her in front of the other people whose opinions mattered to him. He continued moving in social circles where Grace did not seem to have a secure place. Grace, meanwhile, seems to have taken the relationship seriously. She was young, away from home, working in a factory, and emotionally tied to a man who held more power in the situation than she did. Chester could come and go. He could present himself differently to different people. He could enjoy Grace's affection while still keeping open the possibility of another life. For Grace, the consequences were not the same. By the spring of 1906, she was pregnant. In that time and place, an unmarried pregnancy was not simply a private difficulty. It could alter the whole course of a woman's life. It could damage her reputation, affect her family, threaten her employment, and leave her dependent on the man involved to acknowledge what had happened. Grace could not easily make the problem disappear. She could not carry on at the factory as though nothing had changed. She could not openly claim Chester without him accepting responsibility. So she returned home to South Otselic. From there she wrote to him. The letters are one of the most important parts of the case, because they show the pressure Grace was under before she ever reached Big Moose Lake. They're not letters from a woman who had already given up. They are letters from someone waiting, pleading, and trying to understand what Chester intended to do. She wanted him to answer her. She wanted him to make a plan. She wanted to know whether he would marry her, help her, or abandon her. Those letters would later be taken from private life and placed in the front of a courtroom. They'd be read aloud as evidence. They would be discussed by lawyers, printed in newspapers, and used to show the emotional state Grace had been in before her death. Before they became evidence, they were simply her words to Chester. Words written by a young woman who was frightened, pregnant, and still hoping that the man she loved would not leave her to face everything alone. Chester's responses and actions did not give Grace the security she needed. Instead, the situation dragged on. Grace waited. She wrote. She worried. And then Chester suggested a trip. To Grace, the journey seems to have offered hope. She packed as though she might be going away for more than a short visit. Some later accounts suggest she believed they might marry, elope, or find somewhere she could stay until the baby was born. Whatever exact plan Chester had given her, Grace appears to have thought the trip would bring some kind of answer. In July 1906, she left home again. She was 20 years old. She was still trusting Chester Gillette, and she was heading towards the Adirondacks. Chester Ellsworth Gillette was born in 1883. He did not come from the same world as Grace Brown. Grace was a farmer's daughter from South Otselic. Raised in a rural family and sent out into factory work as a young woman. Chester's life had been more unsettled, but he had something Grace did not have. He had the Gillette's name, and in Portland, that name really mattered. His uncle Noah Gillette was connected to the skirt factory where Grace worked, and Chester's position there placed him above the ordinary factory girls. He was not a wealthy man in the grand sense, but beside Grace he had status. He had family connection. He had more room to move. Chester could be careless in ways Grace could not. He could flirt, promise, disappear, return and keep parts of his life separate from one another. He could be affectionate in private and distant in public. He could move along young women socially while keeping Grace in a hidden place, close enough to use, but not close enough to acknowledge. By the time he met Grace, Chester had already developed a reputation as someone who enjoyed company and attention. He was sociable, confident, and drawn to a more fashionable life than the one Grace had come from. He liked parties and the freedom of being young and admired. Grace seems to have loved him seriously. Chester seems to have wanted the relationship on his own terms. That imbalance becomes clearer as the months pass. Their relationship was not conducted openly as an engagement. Grace was not presented as the woman he intended to marry. There was no public promise, no secure future, no proper protection for her if things went wrong. And when Grace became pregnant, the weight of that secrecy fell almost entirely on her. For Chester, the pregnancy was a problem. For Grace, it was her life. She had to leave the factory. She had to go back to her family home. She had to wait for letters, answers, and promises from a man who was not moving with the same urgency she was. Chester had choices. Grace had fewer and fewer. The letters show a young woman trying to pull a definite answer out of a man who kept delaying her. Grace wanted to know what would happen. She wanted him to come to her. She wanted him to write. She wanted him to make clear whether they were going to marry or whether he intended to leave her alone with the pregnancy. Chester did not give her the certainty she needed. He wrote to her, but his actions did not match the seriousness of her situation. While Grace waited at home, Chester continued his life in Cortland. He socialised. He saw other young women. He seemed, at least from the outside, to be trying to keep his future open, while Grace's future was closing around her. By July 1906, Grace was desperate for a decision. Chester then arranged for the two of them to travel. The trip has always been one of the most chilling parts of the case, because it appears to have meant different things to each of them. To Grace, it seemed to have offered hope. She packed more than someone would usually pack for a brief outing. She may have believed they were going away to be married, or that Chester was finally going to arrange somewhere safe for her to stay until the baby was born. After weeks of fear and uncertainty, the journey may have seemed like the answer she'd been waiting for. He did not travel with her under his own name. He used the false name Carl Graham. It was close enough to be useful to him because it carried the same initials as the monogram on his suitcase. But it was still an alias. Grace, by contrast, used her real name. The journey took them into the Adirondacks, through summer resort country, away from Cortland, away from Grace's family, and away from the people who knew their situation. They spent time in Utica and Tupper Lake before coming to Big Moose Lake. There were hotels, stations, roads, boats and stretches of water surrounded by trees. To tourists, it was a place to escape. To Grace, it may have looked like the beginning of a new life. To Chester, it gave distance and privacy. By the time they reached Big Moose Lake, the two of them were carrying the same secret, but not the same intention. In one of the final letters, Grace wrote in a way that suggested she already feared she might never see home again. She referred to her mother, to the thought of leaving, and to the uncertainty of what lay ahead. It's not the kind of letter that reads like a woman excited about a simple holiday. It reads like someone standing at the edge of something she cannot clearly see. But she still went. Grace was afraid, but she still trusted Chester enough to travel with him. She still believed there might be a future if she followed him. The trip to the Adirondack was not simply a romantic journey. It was the moment Grace had been waiting for. The weather appears to have changed their plans. Rain at Tupper Lake may have interrupted whatever outing Chester had arranged there, and so the journey shifted again. They moved on, eventually arriving at Big Moose Lake. Big Moose was remote enough to feel separate from the ordinary world. It sat among forest and mountain country. There were boats for hire, paths through the trees, and stretches of water that could look calm and beautiful from the shore. But the lake was also isolated enough for Chester's purpose, if his purpose was already fixed. At Big Moose Lake, the couple's behaviour drew some attention. Grace was said to seem troubled. She was not carefree. She did not give the impression of a young woman simply enjoying a holiday. One witness later remembered her as sad or distressed, especially around the time before the boat trip. On 11th of July 1906, Chester rented a rowboat. Grace went with him. She told him before that she could not swim. The boat moved out across Moose Lake. From the shore, the Adirondacks would have looked peaceful, trees rising around the water, summer light on the lake, a young man rowing, a young woman with him. The sort of scene that belonged in a holiday postcard. But beyond the shore, away from easy view, the story narrowed. There were no witnesses in the boat. There was only Grace, Chester, and the water. What happened out on the lake was known only to Grace and Chester, but the prosecution later argued that the boat ride had never been innocent. They said Chester had taken Grace to a more isolated part of Big Moose Lake and attacked her there. Grace's body was later found in the water. She'd suffered injuries to her head. Accounts of the case often describe a tennis racket as part of the evidence, and some later versions suggest it may have been used in the attack. Other summaries mention the possibility of an oar. What mattered to the prosecution was that Grace had not simply slipped into the lake by accident. There were signs that something violent had happened before she drowned. Chester's own movements made the scene look even worse. He didn't stay. He didn't raise the alarm as a grieving man who just watched the woman he loved drown. He left. The rowboat was found overturned. Grace's hat and coat were discovered, and at first there was some thought that both young people might have drowned. But then Chester was traced. He'd gone from the lake to the Arrowhead Hotel in Inlet, where he checked in under his real name. When he was eventually confronted, Chester's explanations shifted. At first he denied knowing Grace. Then the story changed. The version that would later become central to his defence was that Grace had jumped into the lake herself, and that he had not been able to save her. But Grace couldn't swim, and Chester knew that. That fact would sit at the centre of the case. The investigation now moved away from the water and into the record of what had happened before the boat ever left the shore. Who had seen them? Where they had stayed? What name Chester had used? What Grace had packed? What she had written? What Chester had said? And the letters Grace had sent him, written in private fear and hope, were about to become the most damaging evidence against him. Once Chester Gillette was found alive, the investigation changed immediately. Investigators began tracing the couple's journey backwards. They looked at the hotels. They looked at the names used in the registers. They spoke to people who'd seen Grace and Chester together. The false name became important. Chester had registered as Carl Graham, while Grace had used her real name. It showed that he'd been trying to hide his identity during the trip, but not so carefully that he abandoned every trace of himself. And the luggage mattered too. Grace had packed heavily, as if expecting to be away for longer than a few days. Chester had not packed in the same way. To investigators and later writers, that difference suggested that Grace and Chester had not understood the trip in the same terms. Grace seemed to be travelling towards a future. Chester seemed to be travelling towards an end. And the letters gave investigators something even stronger. They showed that Grace had been pregnant and that Chester knew. They showed she'd been pressing him for a decision. They also showed she'd been waiting for him to take responsibility. They made it much harder for him to present the trip as a simple holiday that had gone wrong. It had everything that made a case sensational in 1906. A young woman of good reputation, a secret affair, an unmarried pregnancy, a handsome young man from a better connected family, a beautiful resort lake, a mysterious boat ride, and letters that could be read aloud as proof of betrayal. Chester Gillette's trial began later that year, in Herkimer County. By then, the death of Grace Brown had become far more than a local tragedy. Newspapers had followed the investigation closely, and public interest was enormous. People wanted to know what had happened on Big Moose Lake. They wanted to hear those letters. They wanted to see Chester for themselves. The newspapers reported every turn of the case, and Grace's private words became public reading. Some of her letters were printed and circulated beyond the courtroom, turning her grief and fear into something consumed by strangers. But those same letters helped convict the man accused of killing her. On 5th of December 1906, Chester Gillette was found guilty of first-degree murder. The jury had deliberated for several hours before reaching the verdict. Chester was sentenced to death. After his conviction, Chester Gillette was sent to Auburn prison. Auburn was one of the most severe and infamous prisons in New York State, and by the early 20th century, it was also a place associated with the electric chair. Chester entered it as a condemned man, but his case continued to move through the courts. His lawyers appealed. They argued against the conviction. They pushed for a different outcome, but the judgment against him held. In February 1908, the New York Court of Appeals affirmed the conviction. A request for clemency was then placed before Governor Charles Evans Hughes, but that too was refused. Chester Gillette was now facing the end. There are later accounts that before his execution, he spoke privately to spiritual advisors and made some form of confession. The exact contents of those conversations were not fully revealed to the public, and the details have remained part of the larger cloud around the case. On the 30th of March 1908, Chester went to the electric chair. He was 24 years old. The case inspired songs, books, films, and later retellings. Theodore Dreiser used it as the basis for the 1925 novel An American Tragedy. The story was later adapted into film, most famously as A Place in the Sun in 1951. And after the trial had ended and Chester had died, people still talked about Grace Brown. They talked about the letters. They talked about the murder. They talked about the girl who had gone into the Adirondacks and never came home. And eventually, they began to talk about seeing her. The haunting of Grace Brown belongs to the lake. Big Moose Lake became the place where her story remained visible. People came for their holidays, for boating, but behind the scenery was the knowledge that a young woman had died there after being betrayed by the man she trusted. She's said to appear near the water, sometimes as a woman in white, sometimes as a glowing figure, sometimes as a misty shape forming above the lake. The descriptions are not always the same, but they return to the same basic image. A young woman, sorrowful, quiet, and still tied to the place where she died. Some stories place her along the shoreline. Others place her near the buildings and lodges around Big Moose Lake. The Big Moose Inn, which stands close to the water, is often connected to the Grace Brown story. It's long been one of those places where people talk about her presence. Guests and staff have spoken over the years about strange feelings, unusual sounds, and the sense that Grace's story has never quite left the area. The haunting is not usually described as violent. It's described as sad. That's the thing that comes through again and again. She's not remembered as a threatening ghost. She's remembered as a presence of grief. That sadness is what people say they feel. A heaviness near the lake. The sorrow that seems to rise from the water. A sense of someone watching, waiting, or still trying to be heard. One of the most known modern accounts comes from Covewood Lodge in 1988. Covewood Lodge is on Big Moose Lake, and by then, the story of Grace Brown had been part of the area for decades. But in 1988, the story seemed to move from local history back into the present. When the woman named Rhonda Bousselot went into the staff lodge and felt that something was wrong. The feeling came quickly. She sensed that she was not alone inside the building. It was not simply a nervous thought or a passing shiver. It was the feeling of another presence, something close enough to make the space feel occupied. At around the same time, outside the building, 3 other people reportedly saw a figure. It was a young woman. She was standing on the balcony. She wore clothing that looked old-fashioned, not modern clothing, not something that seemed to belong to the late 1980s. She was described as still and silent, looking out towards Big Moose Lake. Then she vanished. For the people who saw her, the connection was obvious. They believed they'd seen the ghost of Grace Brown. There are other accounts from around the lake of people seeing a female figure, or sensing someone near them when no one is there. In some versions, Grace appears in white. In others, the apparition is more like a pale shape or a mist moving over the water. Sometimes she's seen walking, sometimes standing, sometimes looking towards the place where the boat had gone. One account describes 2 women near the lake whose flashlights began to fail. As they looked out across the water, mist seemed to gather and take the form of a woman. Later, one of them saw a photograph of Grace Brown. She believed it was the same figure. Grace's face, her story, and the place where she died all come together. The lake becomes more than scenery. It becomes a memory that can still appear.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
Summer's supposed to be the easy season. So why are so many people quietly Googling a therapist between summer Fridays? Because more daylight doesn't fix the hard stuff. Sometimes it just turns the volume up. Grow does therapy differently. Grow connects you with thousands of high-quality licensed therapists across the U.S., offering both virtual and in-person sessions, nights and weekends. There are no subscriptions, no long-term commitments. You just pay per session. Grow helps you find therapy on your time. The therapist you want takes your insurance on Grow. Grow accepts over 125 insurance plans. Sessions average $21 with insurance, and some pay as little as $0 depending on their plan. Visit growtherapy.com/ACAST today to get started. That's growtherapy.com/ACAST. growtherapy.com/ACAST. Availability and coverage vary by state and insurance plan.
So sad, made me so angry. I bet there are many of you out there fuming away with me. I can feel it coming. It just it really gets me. Really gets my goat, this kind of story. And I know it was very different back then and everything else, but the vulnerability and that kind of imbalance of power. Right, I could go on and on. I'm sure you know what I'm thinking and what I'm feeling. Well, that's it for me today. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll catch you again tomorrow. Take care, everyone.
At Boar's Head, we've been going back to school for over 115 years. And this year, every school lunch is reason to celebrate with the flavors your kids love and the exceptional quality you expect. Helping you make school lunch fresh, easy, and delicious. Ring the bell. The deli is open. Boar's Head, committed to craft since 1905.
Thumbtack presents Uncertainty Strikes. I was surrounded. The aisle and the options were closing in. There were paint rollers, satin and matte finish, angle brushes, and natural bristles. There were too many choices. What if I never got my living room painted? What if I couldn't figure out what type of paint to use? What if I just used Thumbtack? I can hire a top-rated pro that knows everything about interior paint, easily compare prices, and read reviews. Thumbtack knows homes. Download the app today.
Whoever said fork in the road must have been hungry for the Sorrento and Sorrento Turbo Hybrid. Their 3-row seating and 10-year, 100,000-mile limited powertrain warranty. With a capable Sorrento and Sorrento Turbo Hybrid, every way forward is the right way. Visit your local Kia dealer today. Kia, movement that inspires.
Call 800-333-4KIA for details. Drive safely. See retailer for warranty details.
The stories told on the Whispering Woods are inspired by historical records, witness reports, and local folklore. While every effort is made to research and represent events accurately, some details, names, and locations may differ from official accounts or have been changed out of respect for those involved. These episodes are created for storytelling and entertainment purposes and should not be considered definitive fact or investigative journalism.